Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome to the Drowsy Historian, where we dig up the dusty corners of the past and shake off centuries of boring textbook nonsense. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving into one of medieval history's most misunderstood characters, the court jester. Forget everything Disney taught you about jolly fools dancing around with bells. These weren't just medieval stand-up comedians, they were political masterminds disguised as idiots, surviving in a world where one wrong joke could literally cost them their head. Think of them as medieval Twitter trolls, but with actual consequences and way better job security. So grab your favourite caffeinated beverage, dim those lights, and let's explore what it was really like to be the person everyone laughed at, but secretly feared. Chapter 1, The Birth of Professional Foolery. Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Picture this, it's 1347, and Guillaume, the grinning ghoul, is getting dressed for work. But instead of a boring tunic like every other peasant, he's slipping into a patchwork nightmare of clashing colours that would make a rainbow vomit. Those aren't fashion choices, they're survival tactics. See, while everyone else in medieval Europe is desperately trying to blend in and avoid attention, because attention usually meant taxes, conscription, or a nice toasty bonfire, Guillaume is doing the exact opposite. He's making himself the most visible person in the castle. And here's the kicker, he's getting paid handsomely for it. The court jester profession didn't just magically appear one day because some medieval marketing genius thought, hey, let's hire professional idiots. No, it evolved from something much darker. During the brutal famines of the 12th century, when people were literally eating bark to survive, desperate entertainers realized something chilling. The rich would pay good money to laugh at misery, as long as it wasn't their own. Guillaume knew this dirty secret intimately. His grandfather had been one of those starving entertainers who discovered that mocking his own poverty made nobles feel superior and generous. It's peak medieval psychology. Nothing makes you feel better about your cushy life like watching someone else joke about their suffering. But here's where it gets interesting. By Guillaume's time, jesters had figured out how to flip the script. They weren't just mocking themselves anymore, they were using their full status as camouflage for some seriously subversive commentary. Think of it as medieval trolling with actual consequences. The genius was in the costume. That ridiculous motley wasn't just for show, it was a legal loophole. Medieval law recognized that anything said by someone in fool's clothing couldn't be taken seriously, which meant jesters could essentially commit verbal treason daily and call it entertainment. Our boy Guillaume had mastered this art. Just last week, he'd told King Philip VI that his war strategies were about as effective as a chocolate teapot in Hell's Kitchen, and instead of losing his head, he'd received extra wine rations. The secret? Delivery and timing, wrapped in enough theatrical nonsense to maintain plausible deniability. But let's talk about the real dark side nobody mentions. For every Guillaume who made it to royal courts, dozens of would-be jesters died trying. Medieval entertainment was a blood sport, literally. Failed jesters were often beaten, exiled, or worse. The profession had a mortality rate that would make modern stunt performers weep. The transformation from village idiot to court counsellor wasn't accidental either. Smart rulers realized that jesters, being outside the normal social hierarchy, could deliver information that nobles were too proud or terrified to share. Who else could tell a king that his breath smelled like a plague pit without starting a war? Guillaume understood this perfectly. While other courtiers spent their days walking on eggshells and crafting elaborate compliments, he was building genuine relationships through shared laughter and occasionally shared contempt for the very system they all served. The irony is delicious. In an age obsessed with honour, dignity, and social status, the most influential people were often those who had voluntarily abandoned all three. Medieval society's greatest critics weren't scholars or philosophers. They were professional fools who'd turned stupidity into an art form. So next time someone calls you a fool, remember Guillaume. In medieval times, being called an idiot was often the first step toward becoming indispensable. Now that's what I call job security with a side of existential dread. Ready for more twisted medieval career advice? Let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes. So Guillaume survived his first performance, But how the hell did he even get that gig in the first place? Here's where medieval job hunting gets absolutely savage, because landing a court jester position made today's corporate interviews look like friendly chats. Meet Thomas Skelton, not our Guillaume's buddy yet, but another fool clawing his way up the entertainment ladder in 14th century England. While Guillaume was perfecting his act in France, Thomas was about to learn that auditioning for Henry VII meant literally performing for his life. No pressure, right? The interview process was medieval Europe's version of Hunger Games with punchlines. Dozens of would-be jesters would gather outside castle gates, each desperately trying to outwit, outperform, and outsurvive the competition. Because here's the brutal truth your history teacher never mentioned. For every successful court jester, there were probably 50 corpses of failed comedians rotting in unmarked graves. Thomas knew the stakes when he arrived at Westminster Palace in 1485. The previous royal fool had mysteriously disappeared after making a joke about the king's mother. Never a wise career move in medieval times. The position was open, the pay was legendary, but the survival rate was roughly equivalent to being a medieval food taster. The audition itself was psychological warfare disguised as entertainment. Prospective jesters had to perform before the entire court, nobles who viewed them as barely human, courtiers looking for any excuse to eliminate competition, and a monarch whose mood could shift from amusement to homicidal rage faster than you could say knock knock. Thomas watched the first 3 contestants bomb spectacularly. One made a joke about royal spending and was immediately dragged away by guards. Another attempted physical comedy and accidentally knocked over a priceless goblet. His screams echoed through the castle dungeons for weeks. The third guy just froze completely, standing there like a terrified statue until the king ordered him thrown out with the rest of the garbage. But here's where Thomas proved his genius. Instead of trying to avoid dangerous topics, he weaponized them. When his turn came, he walked straight up to King Henry VII and said, "Your Majesty, I hear you're looking for a new fool." Perfect timing. I was just thinking this kingdom could use more honest idiots in high places. The entire court went silent. You could practically hear the collective sphincters clenching as everyone waited to see if Thomas would be executed on the spot. But Henry VII, who wasn't exactly known for his sense of humour, burst out laughing. Why? Because Thomas had managed to simultaneously insult and compliment the king while making himself the butt of his own joke. This was the secret sauce that separated successful jesters from dead comedians. They understood that medieval audiences weren't really laughing at the jokes, they were laughing at the jester's audacity. The humour came from watching someone repeatedly risk death for their entertainment. It's basically medieval snuff comedy, which explains a lot about medieval psychology. The selection process also revealed something disturbing about medieval courts. They were so starved for genuine human interaction that they'd pay handsomely for artificial intimacy. Jesters weren't just entertainers, they were emotional prostitutes, selling the illusion of friendship to people who couldn't trust anyone enough for real relationships. Thomas's successful audition earned him a lifetime appointment, comfortable quarters, and the daily privilege of insulting some of Europe's most dangerous people. But it also sentenced him to a life of perpetual performance, where dropping character for even a moment could mean losing everything, including his head. The really twisted part, most successful jesters came to love their golden cages. The combination of financial security, social access, and intellectual stimulation was addictive. They became willing prisoners of their own success, trapped by the very talents that had saved them from peasant misery. Tomorrow, we'll explore how Thomas and Guillaume developed their survival strategies, because staying alive as a professional fool required skills that would make modern politicians and diplomats weep with envy. Sleep tight, knowing that somewhere in history, the smartest people in the room were the ones everyone called idiots. Chapter 2, Masters of Deadly Wit. Welcome back, Insomniacs. Hope you got some sleep after yesterday's delightful introduction to medieval career counselling. Today, we're diving into the daily survival tactics of our favourite professional fools, because staying alive as a court jester required more strategy than most military campaigns. Let's rejoin Guillaume le Fou, who's now 3 years into his royal employment and has somehow managed to keep his head attached to his shoulders. No small feat, considering he works for a king whose previous hobbies included creative executions and recreational torture. The morning bells of Chateau de Vincennes are ringing, and Guillaume is facing his daily existential crisis: how to be entertaining without being executed. Here's the brutal reality medieval historians love to gloss over. Court jesters had approximately 15 seconds to read a room that could literally kill them. Imagine walking into your office every morning, knowing that your boss's mood could shift from giggly to genocidal based on whether his breakfast eggs were properly cooked. Now imagine your job requires you to mock that same boss for entertainment. Guillaume has developed what I like to call the fool's radar, a supernatural ability to detect royal rage levels through micro-expressions, body language, and the subtle art of observing which courtiers are still breathing from yesterday. On this particular morning in 1350, he notices King Philip VI drumming his fingers in that specific pattern that usually means someone's about to lose a limb. Red flag number 1. The genius of successful jesters like Guillaume wasn't just their humour, it was their psychological profiling skills. They had to become amateur psychiatrists, studying their royal employers with the intensity of modern criminal investigators. Guillaume kept mental notes on Philip's triggers: never joke about money on Mondays, avoid mother jokes during war meetings, and absolutely never mock the king's hairline after he's lost a battle. But here's where things get deliciously twisted. Guillaume also had to maintain his full persona while conducting this psychological analysis. He couldn't be caught studying the king's behaviour too, obviously, because that would shatter the illusion of harmless stupidity that kept him alive. So he perfected the art of looking like a brain-dead entertainer while actually operating as a medieval behavioural analyst. The morning routine was pure theatre. Guillaume would stumble into the great hall, bells jingling, appearing to trip over his own feet while actually surveying the political landscape. Who was sitting where? Which nobles were whispering? Had anyone been mysteriously absent from yesterday's feast? Each observation was filed away for future joke material or survival strategy. His first performance of the day was always the most dangerous, testing the king's mood with carefully calibrated humour. Too safe, and Philip would get bored and possibly violent. Too edgy, and Guillaume would join the growing collection of ex-jesters decorating the castle dungeons. The sweet spot was a narrow band of controlled irreverence that required the precision of a master surgeon. This particular morning, Guillaume opted for his bumbling advisor routine, pretending to offer strategic military advice while actually mocking the king's recent battlefield disasters through deliberate incompetence. "Your Majesty," he announced while juggling imaginary army units, "I've solved your military problems. Simply order the enemy to surrender before fighting them. Works every time." The court erupted in laughter, but Guillaume was watching Philip's eyes like his life depended on it, because it did. The king's initial frown melted into amusement, and Guillaume mentally catalogued another successful mood navigation. He'd survived breakfast entertainment without committing accidental treason. But here's the part that'll make your skin crawl. Guillaume wasn't just performing for the king. He was simultaneously managing the expectations and egos of dozens of nobles, each capable of engineering his downfall if sufficiently offended. Medieval courts were psychological minefields where everyone had the power to destroy everyone else, and jesters had to dance through these dangers while maintaining the illusion of oblivious stupidity. The real kicker? Guillaume genuinely enjoyed the intellectual challenge, which probably makes him either a genius or a psychopath, possibly both. Tomorrow, we'll explore how Guillaume and Thomas developed their signature styles, because medieval comedy required more creativity and risk assessment than modern NASA missions. Sweet dreams, knowing that somewhere in history, the funniest people alive were also the ones closest to death. So Guillaume survived breakfast without losing any appendages. Congratulations to him for achieving the bare minimum of medieval employment success. But here's where his day gets really interesting. Because afternoon entertainment in royal courts wasn't just about making people laugh. It was about information warfare disguised as slapstick comedy. Picture this. It's 2 p.m. The nobles have finished their midday feast, and they're settling in for what they think is harmless entertainment. Guillaume shuffles into the hall, bells jingling like a medieval wind chime, but behind those painted-on grins and exaggerated stumbles, he's operating as Philip VI's unofficial intelligence network. Here's the twisted genius that made jesters indispensable While nobles spent their time lying to each other through diplomatic doublespeak, Guillaume could extract honest information by pretending to be too stupid to understand its importance. It's like being a spy whose cover story is, "I'm too dumb to be a spy." And somehow, it worked brilliantly. Today's performance involves Guillaume's famous mock court routine, where he reenacts recent political events using exaggerated character voices and deliberate misunderstandings. But watch closely. This isn't just comedy. He's testing reactions, gathering intelligence, and conducting psychological warfare through the ancient art of making people laugh at their own secrets. Hear ye, Guillaume announces, waving a wooden scepter like a deranged town crier. Lord Beaumont totally didn't meet with English envoys last Tuesday, and he definitely didn't promise them support in exchange for lands in Normandy. The audience laughs, but Guillaume is watching Beaumont's face turn the colour of fresh blood. Information confirmed, potential traitor identified, possible execution scheduled for later. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, our boy Thomas Skelton is perfecting his own brand of comedic espionage for Henry VII. Thomas has developed what medieval historians call strategic buffoonery, the art of seeming so harmlessly idiotic that people forget he has ears. Nobles would discuss sensitive political matters right in front of him, assuming his jester brain was too scrambled to process important information. But here's the really disturbing part. Both Guillaume and Thomas were essentially running psychological experiments on their audiences every single day. They'd plant fake rumours to see who would spread them, test loyalties through carefully crafted jokes, and manipulate court dynamics by controlling what people found funny about whom. Thomas's afternoon specialty was his confused chronicler bit, where he'd pretend to record court events while getting everything hilariously wrong. Except the wrongness was carefully calculated to reveal who corrected him and how. Today, Lord Winchester definitely didn't receive mysterious gold coins from France, he'd announce while scribbling nonsense on parchment. The guilty parties would invariably react, giving themselves away through nervous laughter or angry denials. The really sick genius was that both jesters had developed methods for sharing this intelligence with their royal employers without breaking character. Guillaume would include prophetic dreams in his evening entertainment, describing visions that coincidentally matched real political threats. Thomas used fortune-telling routines, where his predictions about court intrigue were actually intelligence reports wrapped in mystical nonsense. But let's talk about the elephant in the medieval room. These men were essentially collaborating in systems of oppression and surveillance that would make modern dictatorships proud. They used their humour and apparent harmlessness to identify dissidents, expose plots, and help their kings maintain power through fear and information control. The psychological toll was enormous. Imagine spending every waking moment pretending to be someone else, while secretly betraying the trust of everyone around you. Guillaume and Thomas were living lies wrapped in entertainment, and the stress of maintaining these dual identities was literally killing them slowly. Records suggest both men suffered from what we'd now recognise as severe anxiety disorders, alcoholism, and chronic insomnia, occupational hazards of being professional double agents disguised as court entertainers. The job security came at the cost of their sanity and souls, yet they continued, because the alternative was returning to peasant misery or facing execution for abandoning royal service. They were golden prisoners whose chains were made of laughter and whose cells were decorated with royal favour. Tomorrow, we'll explore how these psychological time bombs, masquerading as entertainers, developed their most dangerous skill, turning political criticism into comedy so subtle that victims applauded their own destruction. Sleep well, knowing that sometimes the most dangerous people in history were the ones everyone thought were harmless idiots. Chapter 3. The Psychology of Sanctioned Subversion. Welcome back to another delightful dive into medieval madness. Today we're exploring the darkest art in human history, how to systematically destroy someone's ego while they pay you for the privilege. Our professional idiots, Guillaume and Thomas, have mastered the breakfast survival game, perfected their afternoon espionage routines, and now they're ready for the ultimate challenge, evening entertainment, where the real psychological warfare begins. It's 1351, and Guillaume is preparing for what court insiders call the reckoning hour, that magical time after dinner when nobles are drunk enough to be honest but sober enough to remember grudges. This is when jesters either cemented their legendary status or joined the ever-growing collection of unmarked graves behind the castle. Here's what makes this so deliciously twisted. Guillaume isn't just going to entertain tonight, he's going to perform character assassination so subtle that his victims will applaud their own destruction. Welcome to psychological warfare disguised as bedtime stories for homicidal royalty. The evening begins with Guillaume's signature historical parallels routine, where he tells supposedly ancient tales that are actually thinly veiled criticisms of current events. Tonight's story, the legend of King Idioticus the Bold, a mythical monarch whose military strategies were so brilliant they consistently resulted in spectacular defeats. Sound familiar, Philip VI? But watch the genius at work. Guillaume doesn't just tell the story straight. He builds elaborate dramatic tension, complete with voice acting, sound effects created by slapping his own body, and interpretive dance that would make modern performance artists weep with inadequacy. The audience is so entertained by the presentation that they miss the systematic demolition of their king's reputation happening right before their eyes. And lo, Guillaume announces, spinning dramatically while his bells create percussion. King Idioticus declared war on 3 neighbouring kingdoms simultaneously, because why fight one war competently when you can lose 3 wars magnificently? The court erupts in laughter, completely missing that Guillaume just called Philip VI an incompetent military strategist to his face. Meanwhile, Thomas Skelton is across the channel, perfecting his own brand of sanctioned sedition for Henry VII. His specialty is mirror comedy, holding up metaphorical mirrors that show uncomfortable truths while pretending they're just random funny stories about fictional characters who definitely don't resemble anyone in the current room. Thomas's current masterpiece involves a tale about Baron Greedsworth, a fictional noble whose taxation policies were so creative they made his peasants eat their own children for survival. The audience laughs at the absurd exaggeration, while somehow not connecting it to their own recent experiences with Henry's innovative revenue collection methods. Here's the psychological brilliance that modern comedians still can't replicate. Both jesters understood that people will accept devastating critiques of themselves if you make the critique entertaining enough and provide them with plausible deniability. Nobody wants to admit they're laughing at their own failures, so they pretend they're laughing at fictional characters instead. But the really disturbing part, Guillaume and Thomas have become so skilled at this that they're starting to believe their own performances. The line between their jester personas and their actual personalities is dissolving, creating what medieval physicians would have called madness of the soul, but what we'd recognize as dissociative identity disorders. Guillaume no longer knows if his thoughts about Philip VI are genuine political analysis or just material for tomorrow's routine. Thomas catches himself thinking about Henry VII's policies exclusively in terms of comedic potential rather than human impact. They're becoming the characters they created to survive, and the transformation is irreversible. The kings, meanwhile, are developing their own psychological dependencies on their jester's validation. Philip VI has started making political decisions based partly on whether they'll provide good material for Guillaume's routines. Henry VII consults Thomas's prophecies when planning military campaigns. The entertainer-audience relationship has evolved into something resembling mutual psychological parasitism. And here's the final twist that'll haunt your dreams. Both jesters have realized they've become more influential than most noble advisors, but their influence is entirely dependent on maintaining the illusion of harmless stupidity. They've achieved unprecedented political power by permanently sacrificing their ability to use it openly. Tomorrow, we'll explore how this psychological house of cards finally starts collapsing when our favorite professional liars discover that some truths are too dangerous to mock, even for people whose job is mocking dangerous truths. Sweet dreams, knowing that sometimes the most honest people in history were professional liars who made careers out of telling truths nobody wanted to hear. So our beloved professional liars have mastered the art of psychological demolition disguised as entertainment. But here's where medieval reality comes crashing down like a castle wall. Some truths are so dangerous that even jesters can't survive telling them. Guillaume and Thomas are about to discover the hard limits of their seemingly infinite immunity. It's 1352, and Guillaume is riding high on his success. He's just finished a particularly brilliant routine mocking Philip VI's latest military disaster, the humiliating defeat at Calais, where French forces were outmaneuvered by English tactics so obviously superior that even the court daubs could have predicted the outcome. The audience loved it. Philip laughed along, and Guillaume went to bed thinking he'd mastered the perfect balance of criticism and comedy. But here's what our overconfident fool missed. He'd crossed an invisible line that he didn't even know existed. While mocking military incompetence was acceptable, Guillaume had inadvertently suggested that English tactics were superior to French ones. In medieval royal psychology, that wasn't just criticism, it was borderline treason wrapped in entertainment. The next morning, Guillaume wakes up to find his usual breakfast privileges revoked. The servants who normally treated him with grudging respect now won't make eye contact. His quarters, previously comfortable by medieval standards, feel suddenly cold and unwelcoming. The king hasn't said anything directly, but the message is clear: you've pushed too far, fool. This is where the real psychological horror of the Jester's life reveals itself. They live in constant uncertainty about where the boundaries actually lie, because those boundaries shift based on royal moods, political pressures, and forces completely beyond their control. What's hilariously acceptable on Tuesday might be treasonously offensive on Wednesday, and there's no way to predict the change. Thomas Skelton is experiencing his own version of this nightmare across the channel. His recent fictional tales about Baron Taxelot's revenue collection methods hit a little too close to home, just as Henry VII was facing peasant uprisings over, you guessed it, creative taxation policies. Thomas's comedy suddenly wasn't providing harmless catharsis. It was potentially inspiring rebellion. Here's the sick irony. Both jesters had become so skilled at their craft that they'd started believing their own invincibility. They forgot that their immunity was always conditional, always dependent on royal whim, and always revocable without notice. They'd made the classic mistake of thinking their talent protected them from the fundamental reality of medieval power structures. Guillaume decides to test the waters with a safer routine about court fashion, but even that backfires spectacularly. His jokes about nobles wearing ridiculous clothing accidentally highlight how much money the court spends on luxury while peasants starve, another topic that's suddenly politically sensitive due to recent grain shortages and rising bread prices. The psychological pressure is crushing both men. They're discovering that their job has evolved from entertain the king to navigate an invisible minefield of constantly shifting political sensitivities while maintaining the illusion of carefree stupidity. It's like playing chess while blindfolded, drunk, and knowing that wrong moves result in execution. Thomas tries adapting by making his material even more abstract, creating comedy so metaphorically distant from reality that it should be impossible to interpret as political commentary. But paranoid monarchs are expert conspiracy theorists, capable of finding hidden meanings in completely innocent entertainment. Henry VII starts seeing coded messages in Thomas's puppet shows about talking animals. The really disturbing part? Both jesters are beginning to crack under the pressure. Guillaume develops a nervous tic where he unconsciously checks for guards whenever he makes a joke. Thomas starts having nightmares about his previous routines, analysing them obsessively for potentially treasonous content he might have missed. Their personalities are fragmenting under the stress of constant performance anxiety mixed with genuine terror. Guillaume finds himself unable to speak naturally anymore. Every casual conversation becomes a careful performance designed to avoid giving offence. Thomas can't look at political events without automatically converting them into comedic material, even when the events involve mass death or suffering. The kings, meanwhile, are trapped in their own psychological prisons. They've become addicted to their jesters' validation, but simultaneously suspicious of their motives. Philip VI wants Guillaume's honest feedback, but punishes him when that feedback is too honest. Henry VII demands Thomas's entertainment, but interprets that entertainment as potential rebellion. It's a perfect storm of mutual psychological destruction, where everyone involved is slowly going insane while pretending everything is perfectly normal. The jesters are losing their minds trying to maintain impossible standards, and the kings are losing their minds trying to control people whose value comes from being uncontrollable. Tomorrow, we'll witness the spectacular psychological meltdowns that result when this system finally collapses, because watching medieval authority figures destroy themselves through paranoia is almost as entertaining as the jesters they're destroying. Sweet dreams, knowing that the funniest job in medieval history was also one of the most psychologically traumatic careers ever invented by human civilization. Chapter 4. The Collapse of the Comedy Empire. Welcome back to another soul-crushing episode of Medieval Career Counseling. Last time, our favourite professional truth-tellers, Guillaume and Thomas, discovered that their seemingly bulletproof immunity had more holes than a plague victim's lungs. Today, we're witnessing the spectacular psychological implosion that happens when paranoid monarchs meet increasingly desperate entertainers. It's 1353, and Guillaume Le Fou is experiencing what modern psychologists would call a complete nervous breakdown, except he has to perform it with bells on while pretending everything is absolutely hilarious. Picture this. You're slowly losing your sanity, but your job requires you to convince everyone, including yourself, that insanity is just another comedic bit. The morning starts with Guillaume's new routine, which I'll generously call defensive comedy for the psychologically unstable. He's abandoned all political material, sticking to safe topics like, well, actually, there are no safe topics anymore. Even jokes about weather could be interpreted as criticism of God's will, which reflects poorly on the king's divine mandate. Guillaume is literally running out of things to make fun of without accidentally committing treason. His latest bit involves juggling while reciting the alphabet backwards in Latin, pure physical skill with zero political content. Except Philip VI, who's now seeing conspiracies in his morning porridge, decides this is obviously coded criticism of French educational systems, because nothing says subversive political commentary, quite like dyslexic acrobatics. Here's where medieval psychology reveals its true horror. Guillaume can't defend himself without breaking character. But staying in character means accepting blame for accusations that make no logical sense. He's trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare where the accusation itself is evidence of guilt, and denying the accusation is further evidence of guilt. Meanwhile, Thomas Skelton is facing his own descent into madness across the English Channel. Henry VII has become convinced that Thomas's recent puppet show about farm animals was actually a detailed allegory for English succession politics. Thomas's innocent story about a pig who wanted to be king is now being analysed by royal scholars for hidden meanings about Henry's legitimacy as monarch. The really twisted part, both jesters are starting to wonder if their kings might be right. When you spend years crafting multi-layered comedic commentary, you begin to question whether you're unconsciously embedding messages, even in your supposedly innocent material. Guillaume finds himself analysing his own alphabet routine, wondering if there's subconscious political symbolism in his juggling patterns. Thomas has developed what can only be described as performance paranoia syndrome. He's become terrified of his own creativity because he can no longer distinguish between intentional political commentary and accidental sedition. Every joke feels like potential suicide, but not joking isn't an option because that would definitively prove he's plotting something. The court dynamics have evolved into something resembling mutual psychological torture. Guillaume's audiences now watch his performances like hawks, searching for hidden meanings and political dog whistles. Every laugh feels forced, every silence feels ominous, and Guillaume can practically hear the mental gears turning as nobles try to decode his supposedly simple entertainment. Philip VI has started bringing scribes to Guillaume's performances, officially to preserve the royal entertainment for posterity, but actually to create transcripts that can be analysed for treasonous content. Guillaume is now performing comedy for an audience that includes official government fact-checkers looking for evidence to use against him. Thomas is experiencing similar surveillance theatre with Henry VII. His puppet shows are now attended by armed guards who take notes on character interactions and plot developments. Thomas finds himself unconsciously editing his material in real time, removing jokes that might be misinterpreted, which makes his performances increasingly awkward and unfunny. But here's the psychological knife twist. Both men are discovering that their survival instincts are destroying the very talents that made them valuable in the first place. Guillaume's comedy has become so sanitized and self-censored that it's barely recognizable as entertainment. Thomas's stories are so generic and inoffensive that they're putting audiences to sleep. The kings, drunk on their own paranoia, haven't noticed that they're systematically destroying the things they claim to value. Philip VI complains that Guillaume isn't as funny as he used to be, while simultaneously creating conditions that make genuine humour impossible. Henry VII demands that Thomas return to his previous comedic brilliance, while maintaining surveillance that makes such brilliance suicidal. It's like watching two people slowly strangle their pets while complaining that the pets aren't as playful as they used to be. The complete lack of self-awareness would be hilarious if it weren't so psychologically devastating for everyone involved. Guillaume and Thomas are realizing they've become prisoners of their own success, trapped in golden cages that are slowly contracting until they can barely breathe, let alone perform. They're learning that sometimes the most dangerous position in medieval society isn't being the king's enemy, it's being irreplaceably valuable to someone who's going insane. Tomorrow, we'll watch these psychological time bombs finally explode when Guillaume attempts one last desperate gambit to save his sanity, and Thomas discovers what happens when court entertainment becomes state-sponsored terrorism. Sweet nightmares, knowing that the funniest people in medieval history died inside long before their bodies caught up, so our psychologically shattered entertainers have reached rock bottom. But here's the thing about medieval rock bottom, there's always another level of hell waiting below. Guillaume and Thomas are about to discover that when paranoid kings finally snap, they take their favourite comedians down with them in spectacularly creative ways. It's autumn 33, and Guillaume has made a decision that proves he's either completely insane or desperately brilliant, possibly both. He's going to attempt what no court jester in recorded history has ever survived, telling a king the absolute, unvarnished truth without any comedic wrapper. No jokes, no metaphors, no protective layer of entertainment. Just brutal honesty delivered by a man in motley who's completely lost his will to live safely. The great hall of Chateau de Vincennes falls silent as Guillaume walks to the centre of the room without his usual theatrical stumbling. No bells jingling, no exaggerated facial expressions, no safety net of performed stupidity. For the first time in 6 years, Guillaume is about to speak as himself, rather than as his jester persona. "Your Majesty," he begins, his voice unnaturally steady. "I have spent years telling you truths wrapped in laughter, but you've become so paranoid that you can no longer distinguish between entertainment and treason. You are destroying the very people who serve you best because you're terrified of your own incompetence being exposed." The court collectively stops breathing. You can practically hear the sound of 40 different people simultaneously calculating their distance to the nearest exit. Guillaume has just committed suicide in the most public way possible, and everyone knows it. But here's where medieval psychology reveals its most twisted secret. Philip VI doesn't explode in rage. He doesn't order immediate execution. Instead, he sits there in stunned silence, because for the first time in months, someone has spoken to him without calculated manipulation or political agenda. The brutal honesty is so shocking that it cuts through his paranoia like a knife through parchment. "Continue," Philip says quietly, and Guillaume realizes he's accidentally stumbled onto something more dangerous than treasonous comedy. The king's desperate hunger for genuine human connection in a world of professional liars. Meanwhile, Thomas Skelton is experiencing his own version of psychological breakdown across the channel. But instead of choosing brutal honesty, Thomas has decided to embrace complete fictional absurdity. If Henry VII wants to find political meanings in innocent entertainment, Thomas will give him entertainment so bizarrely meaningless that even the most creative conspiracy theorist couldn't extract sedition from it. Thomas's final performance involves a one-man play featuring himself as a sentient piece of cheese engaged in philosophical debates with imaginary bread. The plot, such as it exists, revolves around dairy-based existential crises and carbohydrate-related theological questions. Its performance art so deliberately insane that it makes modern experimental theatre look comprehensible. The genius of Thomas's approach becomes clear as Henry VII sits there trying to decode the political implications of cheese philosophy. The king's paranoia has become so extreme that he's convinced there must be hidden meanings in Thomas's dairy-themed madness, but the material is so genuinely nonsensical that even the royal fact-checkers give up trying to find seditious content. Back in France, Guillaume's gamble is paying off in ways he never expected. Philip VI, starved for honest feedback after months of paranoid isolation, begins using Guillaume as his personal confessor and advisor. But this creates an entirely new kind of psychological prison. Guillaume is now trapped in the role of unofficial royal therapist, responsible for managing a monarch's mental health while maintaining his Jester identity. The really disturbing part is that both men discover their new roles are somehow more psychologically damaging than their previous ones. Guillaume finds himself genuinely caring about Philip VI's well-being, which makes his criticism feel like personal betrayal rather than professional duty. Thomas realizes his descent into performative madness has started affecting his actual sanity. He's beginning to think like the characters he portrays. Philip VI becomes increasingly dependent on Guillaume's honest counsel, but also increasingly resentful of needing it. The king simultaneously craves and despises Guillaume's insights, creating a relationship that's equal parts therapeutic and toxic. Guillaume has become the royal emotional support jester, which is somehow more dehumanizing than being a simple entertainer. Thomas's situation evolves differently but equally disturbing. Henry VII becomes convinced that Thomas's apparent madness is actually supernatural wisdom disguised as insanity. The king starts treating Thomas's random nonsense as prophetic utterances, making political decisions based on the philosophical implications of imaginary cheese conversations. Both jesters have accidentally achieved the ultimate jester paradox. They've become so indispensable to their king's psychological survival that they can never leave their positions. But staying in those positions is slowly destroying their own sanity. They're trapped in codependent relationships with mentally unstable monarchs who have unlimited power over their lives. The courts around them have devolved into theatrical madness, where everyone is performing sanity while slowly losing their minds. Nobles pretend Guillaume's honest counsel is still comedic entertainment. Courtiers act like Thomas's cheese philosophy makes perfect sense. Reality has become a shared delusion that everyone maintains because the alternative is admitting the entire system has collapsed. Tomorrow, we'll explore how these psychologically destroyed men attempt to find meaning in their impossible situations and whether it's possible to maintain humanity while serving as emotional support systems for homicidal monarchs. Sweet dreams. Remembering that sometimes the most honest relationships in history were built on foundations of mutual psychological destruction. Chapter 5. The Price of Honesty in a World of Lies. Our mentally shattered entertainers, Guillaume and Thomas, discovered that surviving royal paranoia required either brutal honesty or complete absurdity. Today, we're diving into the aftermath of those choices. Because in medieval courts, even successful survival strategies come with horrifying psychological costs. It's winter 34, and Guillaume le Fou has achieved something unprecedented in Jester history. He's become King Philip VI's unofficial therapist, advisor, and emotional crutch, all while maintaining his official status as professional idiot. But here's the twisted irony. This promotion to royal confidant has created a new kind of hell that makes his previous paranoid surveillance look like a relaxing vacation. Picture Guillaume's new daily routine. He wakes up, puts on his motley costume, and reports to Philip VI's private chambers for what medieval historians euphemistically call morning consultations. These aren't comedic performances, they're full-blown therapy sessions where Guillaume listens to the king's neuroses, relationship problems, military anxieties, and general existential crises while pretending this is all part of his entertainment duties. The really disturbing part, Guillaume is actually good at this psychological counselling, which suggests that successful jesters were basically unlicensed medieval therapists all along. He's developed techniques for managing royal mood swings, de-escalating political paranoia, and providing emotional validation to a man who could have him executed for yawning at the wrong moment. But here's where it gets genuinely horrifying. Philip VI has become psychologically addicted to Guillaume's honest feedback. The king can no longer make decisions without consulting his jester, can't sleep without Guillaume's evening entertainment sessions that are actually bedtime therapy, and flies into rage when Guillaume isn't immediately available to manage his emotional crises. Guillaume has essentially become the royal emotional support animal. except he's human and therefore capable of suffering existential dread about his situation. He's trapped in a codependent relationship with a homicidal monarch who treats him simultaneously as trusted advisor and disposable entertainment. It's like being someone's best friend and their pet at the same time. Meanwhile, Thomas Skelton's descent into performative madness has created its own psychological nightmare across the English Channel. Henry VII has decided that Thomas's cheese philosophy represents divine wisdom, delivered through holy madness, which means Thomas is now accidentally serving as the king's spiritual advisor while maintaining his reputation as a complete lunatic. Thomas's daily routine involves delivering prophetic utterances that are actually random nonsense he makes up on the spot, but Henry VII interprets these as mystical guidance for running the kingdom. Thomas finds himself inadvertently influencing major policy decisions through deliberately meaningless statements about dairy products and bread relationships. The psychological toll is crushing both men in different ways. Guillaume is exhausted from constantly managing Philip VI's mental health while never being able to seek support for his own psychological needs. Who does the royal therapist talk to when he needs therapy? There's no medieval equivalent of professional counselling for people whose job is providing professional counselling to insane monarchs. Thomas is losing his grip on reality because he can no longer distinguish between his performed madness and his actual thoughts. When you spend months pretending to believe that cheese has philosophical insights, part of your brain starts treating that premise as potentially legitimate. Thomas is experiencing what psychologists would now call method acting syndrome, taken to psychotic extremes. Both men are discovering that their kings have become emotionally parasitic. Philip VI drains Guillaume's psychological energy through constant demands for reassurance, advice, and emotional management. Henry VII consumes Thomas's sanity by treating his deliberate nonsense as profound wisdom that must be continuously produced and refined. The really sick part, neither Jester can quit or even reduce their responsibilities, because their kings now view them as essential life support systems. Guillaume's honest feedback has become so central to Philip VI's decision-making process that the king literally cannot function without it. Thomas's divine madness is now incorporated into Henry VII's spiritual worldview to the point where losing Thomas would constitute a religious crisis. They've achieved the ultimate Jester paradox. They're simultaneously the most powerful and most powerless people in their respective kingdoms. Guillaume influences major political decisions, but can't choose his own daily schedule. Thomas shapes royal spiritual beliefs, but can't express his own genuine thoughts without maintaining his insane persona. The courts around them have adapted to these new dynamics in ways that would make modern psychologists weep. Nobles now treat Guillaume's therapy sessions with Philip VI as entertainment spectacles, applauding the king's emotional breakthroughs like their comedic performances. Courtiers discuss Thomas's cheese philosophy as if it's legitimate theological scholarship. Everyone is participating in shared delusions that maintain the pretense of normalcy, while the entire system slowly collapses into mutual psychological dependence and performative madness. It's like watching an entire civilization develop Stockholm Syndrome with their own political institutions. Tomorrow, we'll explore how Guillaume and Thomas attempt to maintain their sanity while serving as emotional support systems for increasingly unstable monarchs, and whether it's possible to find meaning in relationships built on professional dishonesty and mutual psychological exploitation. Sweet dreams. Knowing that sometimes the most trusted advisors in history were people who couldn't trust anyone with their own problems. So Guillaume and Thomas have become unwilling therapists to the most dangerous patients in medieval Europe. But here's where their psychological horror story takes an even darker turn. They're starting to realize that their kings aren't just mentally unstable, they're emotional vampires who feed on their Jester's sanity to maintain their own fragile grip on reality. It's spring 1355. And Guillaume is experiencing what modern psychologists would recognize as severe caregiver burnout, except his patient has absolute power over his life and death. Philip VI has developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when Guillaume is having his own emotional difficulties, not out of concern for his Jester's well-being, but because Guillaume's personal problems interfere with his ability to provide royal emotional support. The morning routine has evolved into something resembling psychological warfare disguised as breakfast entertainment. Philip VI monitors Guillaume's facial expressions, voice tone, and energy levels with the intensity of a predator studying prey. If Guillaume seems distracted by his own problems, the king becomes petulant and demanding, requiring even more emotional labor to manage his wounded ego. "You seem distant today, my fool," Philip observes during one of their morning consultations, and Guillaume recognizes this as a trap. If he admits to having personal problems, Philip will either dismiss them as irrelevant compared to royal concerns, or become jealous that Guillaume's attention isn't completely focused on royal needs. If he denies having problems, Philip will accuse him of dishonesty and emotional withdrawal. Guillaume has learned to navigate these impossible situations by performing emotional availability even when he's internally collapsing. He's developed what can only be called therapeutic theatre, maintaining the illusion of being psychologically present and emotionally supportive while carefully hiding his own mental deterioration. Meanwhile, Thomas Skelton is discovering that Henry VII's addiction to divine madness has created its own form of emotional parasitism. The king doesn't just want Thomas's random philosophical nonsense. He wants Thomas to be genuinely inspired while delivering it. Henry VII has become expert at detecting when Thomas is just going through the motions versus when he's authentically channeling whatever twisted creativity produces his cheese-based theological insights. This creates an impossible psychological burden. Thomas must maintain genuine enthusiasm for deliberately meaningless content while pretending to be insane, but not actually going insane, all while providing spiritual guidance he doesn't believe in to a king who might execute him if the guidance proves ineffective. Henry VII has started timing Thomas's prophetic utterances to coincide with major political decisions, which means Thomas is now accidentally responsible for the outcomes of policies based on his improvised nonsense. When his random predictions about cheese philosophy correlate with successful military campaigns, Henry VII credits Thomas with divine insight. When they don't, Thomas faces subtle threats about the consequences of providing inadequate spiritual guidance. Both jesters are experiencing what medieval physicians would have called melancholy of the soul, but what we'd recognize as clinical depression caused by impossible working conditions. Guillaume finds himself unable to experience genuine emotions because all his emotional energy is consumed by managing Philip VI's psychological needs. Thomas can no longer distinguish between his performed insanity and his actual mental state because the performance has become so psychologically demanding. The really disturbing part is that both kings have developed sophisticated techniques for extracting maximum psychological labor from their jesters while providing minimal emotional reciprocity. Philip VI treats Guillaume's honest counsel as a service he deserves rather than a gift he should appreciate. Henry VII views Thomas's spiritual guidance as proof of divine favor toward his reign rather than evidence of Thomas's creative intelligence. Guillaume has started having nightmares where he's trapped in an endless cycle of providing emotional support to Philip VI, waking up exhausted from dream therapy sessions with his royal patient. Thomas experiences waking hallucinations where his cheese philosophy characters start offering him advice, suggesting his performed madness is bleeding into his unconscious mind. The psychological isolation is crushing both men. Guillaume can't seek emotional support from other courtiers because that would reveal his human vulnerabilities, which might undermine his effectiveness as royal therapist. Thomas can't express his genuine thoughts or feelings because maintaining his insane persona has become essential for survival. They're both discovering that emotional labor, when extracted under threat of death, becomes a form of psychological slavery, more devastating than physical bondage. Their minds belong to their kings as completely as their bodies, but mental ownership is infinitely more invasive and destructive than physical control. The courts have evolved into systems of institutionalized psychological abuse, where everyone participates in maintaining illusions that protect royal egos at the expense of human sanity. Nobles applaud Guillaume's entertainment sessions with Philip VI, while knowing they're watching therapeutic manipulation. Courtiers discuss Thomas's divine wisdom, while understanding its performed madness designed to manage royal spiritual insecurity. Both men are trapped in relationships that combine the worst aspects of abusive partnerships with the power dynamics of master-slave relationships and the emotional demands of professional caregiving. They're simultaneously intimate confidants, disposable servants, and psychological prisoners whose value depends on their ability to sustain their captor's mental health. The ultimate irony? Guillaume and Thomas have achieved unprecedented influence over their monarch's decision-making processes, but that influence is entirely dependent on their willingness to sacrifice their own psychological well-being for royal emotional stability. They've gained power by surrendering their humanity, and they're starting to question whether the trade was worth it. Tomorrow, we'll explore how these psychologically enslaved entertainers attempt to reclaim fragments of their sanity while maintaining the therapeutic relationships that keep them alive, but slowly destroy their souls. Sweet dreams, knowing that sometimes the most powerful people in history were those who'd completely lost control over their own minds. Chapter 6, Searching for Sanity in a Mad World. It's summer 3056, and Guillaume Le Fou has developed what can only be described as therapeutic split personality disorder. He's created separate psychological compartments for his Jester persona, his therapist role, and whatever fragments remain of his actual human identity. The mental gymnastics required to maintain these distinct cells, while never allowing them to contaminate each other, is slowly driving him completely insane. Picture Guillaume's secret coping mechanism. Late at night, after Philip VI has fallen asleep following their evening entertainment session, which was actually a 2-hour therapy discussion about the king's childhood trauma and military inadequacies, Guillaume retreats to his quarters and talks to himself in mirrors, not rehearsing tomorrow's performance, literally conducting conversations with his own reflection, as if it's a separate person who understands his situation. "So, how was work today?" Mirror Guillaume asks. Regular Guillaume. And the conversations that follow would make modern psychiatrists reach for their prescription pads. Guillaume has essentially created an internal support group with himself as the only member, discussing his professional challenges with his reflection, because he literally has no one else who can understand the psychological horror of his daily existence. The really twisted part? Guillaume's self-therapy sessions are more psychologically sophisticated than most actual medieval medical treatment. He's developed techniques for emotional compartmentalization, stress management, and identity preservation that wouldn't be formally recognized by psychology for another 6 centuries. He's accidentally become his own therapist while serving as everyone else's unpaid psychological counselor. Meanwhile, Thomas Skelton has found his own disturbing coping mechanism across the English Channel. He started writing secret journals, where he records his genuine thoughts and feelings. But here's the catch. He writes them in the voice of his cheese philosophy characters. Thomas has created an entire fictional universe where dairy products and bread discuss the psychological trauma of serving insane monarchs through performed madness. Thomas's journal entries read like medieval existential philosophy written by someone who's completely lost their grip on reality. Today, the wise Cheddar observed that serving kings who mistake madness for wisdom creates a peculiar form of suffering where one's sanity becomes a liability rather than an asset. It's profound psychological insight delivered through the voice of imaginary cheese, which perfectly captures the absurdist nightmare his life has become. Both men are discovering that maintaining sanity in insane situations requires developing insane coping mechanisms, which creates a psychological paradox that would make ancient philosophers weep. They're staying mentally stable by embracing controlled forms of mental instability, using deliberate madness to protect themselves from involuntary psychological collapse. Guillaume's mirror conversations have evolved into elaborate role-playing scenarios where different aspects of his personality debate the ethical implications of his professional choices. His Jester self argues that survival justifies any psychological manipulation necessary. His therapist self insists that he's providing genuine help to Philip VI despite the coercive circumstances. His human self just wants to run away and become a hermit somewhere far from royal courts. Thomas's cheese philosophy has become his psychological escape hatch from the crushing weight of accidentally influencing major political decisions through improvised nonsense. When Henry VII makes military decisions based on Thomas's random theological insights about dairy products, Thomas retreats into his fictional universe where the consequences of his words are just imaginary conversations between bread and cheese rather than real policies affecting thousands of lives. The psychological isolation is creating new forms of mental illness that wouldn't be formally studied for centuries. Guillaume is developing what modern psychologists would recognize as dissociative identity disorder caused by occupational stress. Thomas is experiencing reality detachment syndrome, brought on by the cognitive dissonance of providing meaningful guidance through meaningless content. But here's the part that'll haunt your dreams. Both men are starting to prefer their private psychological refuges to their actual lives. Guillaume's mirror conversations are becoming more engaging than his real relationships. Thomas's cheese philosophy discussions feel more authentic than his interactions with actual humans. They're retreating into controlled madness because reality has become unmanageably insane. The courts around them remain blissfully unaware that their most trusted advisors are slowly fragmenting into multiple personalities and imaginary philosophical system. Philip VI continues demanding Guillaume's therapeutic support without recognizing that his therapist is secretly conducting therapy sessions with his own reflection. Henry VII keeps seeking Thomas's spiritual guidance without realizing that his advisor has created an entire alternate reality populated by sentient dairy products. Both jesters have stumbled onto a disturbing truth about medieval psychology. In a world where honesty is dangerous and genuine, human connection is impossible. The only way to maintain sanity is through carefully constructed forms of controlled insanity that provide psychological shelter from uncontrolled madness. They're learning that survival in medieval courts requires not just political intelligence and comedic timing, but also the ability to create private psychological worlds that remain hidden from the public personas that keep them alive. Tomorrow, we'll explore how Guillaume and Thomas's secret coping mechanisms start bleeding into their professional performances, creating new forms of entertainment that nobody understands but everyone finds strangely compelling. Sweet dreams. Knowing that sometimes the sanest response to an insane world is embracing just enough madness to stay functional. So Guillaume's mirror therapy sessions and Thomas's cheese philosophy journals were supposed to be private refuges from their psychological nightmare jobs. But here's the thing about carefully constructed madness. It has a nasty habit of leaking into your professional life when you least expect it. Our favorite mentally fragmented entertainers are about to discover that their secret coping mechanisms are becoming their most compelling public performances. It's autumn 3056, and Guillaume makes a mistake that changes everything. During one of his morning consultations with Philip VI, he accidentally slips into the voice he uses for his mirror conversations. Instead of his usual jester persona or his therapeutic counselor tone, he starts speaking as Mirror Guillaume, the brutally honest version of himself that only emerges during his private psychological refuge sessions. "You know, Your Majesty," Guillaume says in this unnaturally direct voice, "I've been thinking about your father issues, and I believe they're directly connected to your compulsive need to start wars you can't win." The court goes silent, because this isn't Guillaume's usual careful therapeutic approach, or his traditional comedic deflection. This is raw psychological analysis delivered with the emotional detachment of someone observing the situation from outside reality. But here's where medieval psychology reveals another twisted layer. Philip VI is absolutely fascinated by this new version of Guillaume. The king has grown tired of careful therapy and diplomatic comedy. He's craving the brutal honesty that only emerges from someone who's partially dissociated from normal human emotional responses. Guillaume realizes he's accidentally discovered a new form of entertainment, psychological analysis delivered by someone who's mentally detached enough to treat royal neuroses as fascinating case studies rather than dangerous political territory. It's like watching a medieval version of clinical psychology performed as avant-garde theatre. Meanwhile, Thomas Skelton is experiencing his own version of this phenomenon. His cheese philosophy has become so psychologically sophisticated that it's accidentally producing genuine spiritual insights wrapped in deliberately absurd packaging. When Thomas channels his wise cheddar persona during court performances, he's actually delivering profound theological commentary about power, corruption, and human nature. He just happens to be doing it through the voice of imaginary dairy products. Henry VII starts bringing religious scholars to analyze Thomas's performances, not because they're obviously profound, but because they contain layers of meaning that seem to reveal themselves gradually. Thomas's controlled madness has evolved into something resembling mystical poetry, where the surface absurdity conceals genuine wisdom about the human condition. The psychological mechanism at work is both brilliant and terrifying. Both jesters have created alternate personalities that are psychologically removed enough from their survival anxieties to speak truths they could never express as their normal selves. Their coping mechanisms have accidentally produced new forms of honesty that are more powerful than anything they achieved through traditional jester techniques. Guillaume's mirror voice becomes his signature performance style, delivering psychological insights with the emotional detachment of someone analyzing specimens in a laboratory. Philip VI becomes addicted to this clinical honesty because it provides brutal feedback without the emotional manipulation that characterizes most court relationships. Thomas's cheese philosophy performances evolve into elaborate theological discussions where sentient dairy products debate complex spiritual questions about power, mortality, and divine justice. The absurdist packaging makes the content feel safe for audiences while delivering commentary that would be treasonous if expressed directly. But here's the disturbing reality. Both men are essentially monetizing their psychological trauma. Their mental fragmentation has become their most valuable professional skill. They're being rewarded for the psychological damage that their jobs have inflicted on them, creating a feedback loop where professional success requires continued mental deterioration. Guillaume finds himself deliberately cultivating his dissociative episodes because the mirror voice persona is more politically effective than his traditional approaches. He's training himself to become more psychologically detached because emotional distance makes him a better royal therapist. Thomas starts spending more time in his cheese philosophy headspace because those fictional conversations produce better insights than his normal thought processes. He's choosing controlled madness over sanity because madness makes him more useful to Henry VII. The courts are evolving to accommodate these new forms of entertainment without understanding what they're actually witnessing. Nobles applaud Guillaume's clinical psychological analysis as innovative comedy. Religious scholars debate Thomas's dairy-based theology as if it's legitimate spiritual discourse. Everyone is participating in a shared delusion where psychological breakdown is celebrated as artistic breakthrough, where mental illness is confused with creative genius, and where the most damaged people are treated as the most insightful. Guillaume and Thomas have achieved something unprecedented in jester history. They found ways to be completely honest about their observations while remaining safely protected by their reputations for madness. Their psychological trauma has accidentally created the perfect camouflage for delivering unfiltered truth. The ultimate irony is that their secret coping mechanisms, designed to preserve their sanity, have become more psychologically demanding than their original professional roles. They're working harder to maintain their controlled madness than they ever worked to perform traditional comedy. Tomorrow, we'll explore how Guillaume's clinical detachment and Thomas's mystical absurdism start influencing the political decisions of their respective kingdoms. Because when psychologically fragmented entertainers become trusted advisors, the line between wisdom and madness disappears entirely. Sleep tight, knowing that sometimes the most honest insights come from people who've lost touch with emotional reality. Chapter 7. When madness becomes statecraft, Guillaume's mirror voice and Thomas's cheese philosophy have evolved from desperate coping mechanisms into the most trusted advisory voices in their respective kingdoms. But here's where medieval statecraft reveals its most terrifying secret. When psychologically fragmented entertainers become the primary sources of political guidance, entire nations start operating according to the logic of controlled madness. It's winter 3050, and Philip VI has made a decision that would horrify political theorists for centuries. He started bringing Guillaume to actual military strategy meetings, not as entertainment, but as a psychological analyst tasked with predicting enemy behavior through clinical detachment. Guillaume sits in war councils wearing his motley, while delivering brutally honest assessments of French military capabilities using the same emotionally distant tone he developed for his mirror therapy sessions. The English will exploit our cavalry's psychological need to charge directly into obvious traps, Guillaume observes in his unnaturally clinical voice, because French knights would rather die gloriously than light strategically, which suggests deep-seated cultural trauma regarding masculine identity and class validation. The assembled generals stare at him in stunned silence, partly because his analysis is devastatingly accurate, and partly because they're receiving military psychology lessons from someone dressed like a rainbow. The really disturbing part? Guillaume's psychological detachment makes him genuinely effective at strategic analysis. His dissociative episodes allow him to observe French military culture with the objectivity of an outside researcher rather than the emotional investment of a patriotic citizen. His mental fragmentation has accidentally created the perfect mindset for intelligence analysis. Meanwhile, Thomas Skelton's cheese philosophy has infiltrated Henry VII's spiritual worldview so completely that the king now makes policy decisions based on theological insights delivered by imaginary dairy products. Henry's morning prayers include consultations with Thomas's divine cheddar about the spiritual implications of taxation policies and military campaigns. The wise cheddar suggests that excessive taxation creates spiritual imbalance in the kingdom, Thomas announces during a treasury meeting, channeling his fictional cheese persona with the same intensity he once reserved for private journal sessions. When rulers consume too much of their subjects' wealth, they develop spiritual indigestion that manifests as political instability. Henry VII nods gravely and adjusts tax rates based on dairy-based theological advice. Both jesters have stumbled into something that wouldn't be formally recognized until modern times. Their psychological trauma has accidentally created primitive versions of systems thinking and behavioral analysis. Guillaume's clinical detachment allows him to see patterns in French political behavior that emotionally invested advisors miss. Thomas's absurdist framework helps him identify contradictions in English policy that conventional wisdom overlooks. The military applications are immediately apparent and deeply disturbing. Guillaume's psychological insights help Philip VI predict English tactical decisions with unprecedented accuracy. When Guillaume analyzes Edward III's personality profile using his mirror voice clinical approach, he correctly anticipates English strategy at the Battle of Poitiers months before it happens. Thomas's theological absurdism proves equally effective for predicting Scottish political behaviour. His cheese philosophy contains genuine insights about power dynamics and social psychology that help Henry VII navigate complex diplomatic situations. When Thomas's theological Gouda warns about the spiritual dangers of broken treaties, Henry VII avoids political disasters that conventional advisors never saw coming. But here's where this psychological experiment in governance takes a genuinely horrifying turn. Both kings are becoming psychologically dependent on their jesters' fragmented perspectives. Philip VI can no longer make strategic decisions without Guillaume's clinical analysis. Henry VII treats Thomas's absurdist theology as essential spiritual guidance for royal decision-making. The jesters have accidentally created new forms of political authority based on psychological dysfunction rather than traditional qualifications. Guillaume wields influence over French military strategy through dissociative disorders. Thomas shapes English domestic policy through controlled schizophrenic episodes disguised as mystical wisdom. The courts are adapting to these new advisory roles in ways that reveal the fundamental insanity of medieval political systems. Nobles treat Guillaume's psychological analysis as entertainment while acting on his strategic recommendations. Religious authorities debate Thomas's cheese theology as legitimate spiritual discourse while implementing policies based on his fictional insights. Guillaume and Thomas are discovering that their mental illnesses have become their most valuable political assets. The same psychological fragmentation that makes normal human relationships impossible has made them incredibly effective at analyzing political situations with superhuman objectivity. The ultimate irony is that their controlled madness is producing better governance than the supposedly rational decision-making processes of conventional advisors. Guillaume's clinical detachment reveals truths about French political culture that patriotic bias obscures. Thomas's absurdist framework exposes contradictions in English policy that logical analysis misses. Both men are trapped in a new kind of psychological prison. They're too valuable to their kingdoms to ever recover their sanity, but too mentally fragmented to enjoy the power they've accidentally accumulated. They've become indispensable by becoming inhuman, and they're starting to realize that the trade-off might be irreversible. Their success is teaching them that medieval political systems reward psychological dysfunction over mental health, encourage emotional detachment over human empathy, and value analytical precision over personal well-being. They're the most influential advisors in their respective kingdoms precisely because they've lost the ability to care about normal human concerns. Tomorrow, we'll explore how Guillaume's clinical military analysis and Thomas's theological absurdism start shaping the broader political landscape of medieval Europe, because when controlled madness becomes foreign policy, international relations take on entirely new dimensions of psychological warfare. Guillaume's clinical military psychology and Thomas's theological cheese diplomacy have proven so effective domestically that both kingdoms are about to export their innovative, madness-based governance to international relations. And the results are going to make medieval European politics even more psychologically twisted than anyone thought possible. It's spring 3058, and Philip VI has made a decision that will traumatize diplomatic historians for centuries. He's sending Guillaume to negotiate with English representatives as France's official psychological warfare specialist. Guillaume will attend peace talks, not as entertainment, but as a strategic analyst, tasked with psychologically destabilizing English negotiators through clinical observation and therapeutic manipulation disguised as jester performance. The Calais negotiations begin with English diplomats expecting traditional French arrogance and political posturing. Instead, they're greeted by Guillaume in full motley, who immediately begins analyzing their negotiation tactics with the detached precision of a medieval behavioral scientist. Your opening demands reveal deep insecurity about English territorial legitimacy in France, Guillaume observes in his unnaturally clinical voice while juggling 3 balls. The psychological aggression underlying your diplomatic language suggests compensation for fundamental doubts about the sustainability of your military occupation. The English negotiators are simultaneously insulted and unnerved because they're being psychoanalyzed by someone dressed like a children's entertainer. Guillaume's strategy is brilliant and deeply disturbing. He's using his jester persona as cover for conducting psychological warfare that conventional diplomats couldn't attempt without causing international incidents. His clinical observations about English political psychology are delivered with such apparent innocence that the English can't formally object without admitting they're being effectively analysed by a fool. Meanwhile, Henry VII has decided to test Thomas's cheese philosophy on Scottish diplomatic relations. Thomas accompanies English envoys to Edinburgh, officially as royal entertainment, but actually as a theological advisor, whose absurdist framework might provide insights into Scottish political motivations that conventional analysis misses. The Scottish court is initially amused by Thomas's dairy-based theological presentations, but the amusement turns to confusion and then concern as they realise his cheese philosophy contains genuinely sophisticated analysis of Anglo-Scottish relations wrapped in deliberately ridiculous packaging. The divine cheddar observes that Scottish independence claims create spiritual turbulence in the cosmic dairy ecosystem, Thomas announces during a formal diplomatic dinner. When kingdoms consume each other's territorial integrity, they develop political lactose intolerance that manifests as perpetual military indigestion. The Scottish negotiators spend hours trying to decode whether this is profound political commentary or complete nonsense. The psychological effect is devastating. Both English diplomatic initiatives succeed because foreign courts can't effectively counter negotiation strategies that operate through controlled madness. How do you develop diplomatic responses to clinical psychological analysis delivered by a jester? How do you argue against theological insights provided by imaginary cheese? Guillaume's clinical detachment allows him to identify psychological weaknesses in English diplomatic positions that French conventional negotiators never recognized. His therapeutic training helps him manipulate English emotional responses while maintaining plausible deniability through his full persona. He's essentially conducting psychological warfare disguised as entertainment. Thomas's absurdist theology proves equally effective against Scottish diplomatic resistance. His cheese philosophy contains genuine insights about power dynamics and territorial psychology that help English negotiators understand Scottish motivations better than traditional political analysis. His controlled madness provides a framework for political understanding that transcends conventional diplomatic logic. But here's where this experiment in therapeutic statecraft reveals its most disturbing implications. Guillaume and Thomas are accidentally pioneering forms of psychological manipulation that wouldn't be formally studied until the 20th century. They're using clinical detachment and absurdist frameworks to conduct primitive versions of psychological operations against foreign governments. The international community is struggling to develop responses to diplomatic strategies that operate through mental illness and controlled insanity. Traditional diplomatic protocols assume rational actors operating within conventional political frameworks. Nobody has contingency plans for negotiating with clinically detached jesters who analyze psychological motivations, or theologians who channel divine wisdom through imaginary dairy products. Guillaume's success at Calais establishes a terrifying precedent. Psychological analysis delivered through jester personas can be more effective than conventional diplomatic pressure. Other kingdoms start wondering if they need their own mentally fragmented entertainers to compete in this new landscape of therapeutically enhanced international relations. Thomas's theological diplomacy creates similar ripple effects throughout medieval European religious communities. Church authorities begin debating whether absurdist spiritual frameworks might provide genuine insights into divine will regarding political matters. Some monasteries start experimenting with deliberately nonsensical theological approaches inspired by Thomas's cheese philosophy. Both jesters are discovering that their psychological disorders have accidentally created new forms of soft power that traditional diplomatic and military capabilities can't counter. Their mental illnesses have become strategic advantages that give their kingdoms unprecedented influence over international relations. The really twisted part is that Guillaume and Thomas are becoming more psychologically fragmented as their diplomatic effectiveness increases. The international success of their therapeutic governance requires them to cultivate even greater emotional detachment and more sophisticated forms of controlled madness. They're trapped in a feedback loop where professional success demands continued psychological deterioration, but psychological deterioration produces professional advantages that make them increasingly valuable to their kingdoms. They can't recover their sanity without losing their political influence, but maintaining their influence requires sacrificing whatever fragments of humanity they have left. The medieval European political landscape is adapting to accommodate governance through controlled psychological dysfunction, and the implications are going to reshape international relations in ways that make traditional military conquest look simple and straightforward. Tomorrow, we'll explore how Guillaume's therapeutic diplomacy and Thomas's absurdist theology start influencing the broader cultural and intellectual development of medieval Europe. Because when madness becomes statecraft, entire civilizations begin operating according to the logic of psychological fragmentation. Chapter 8. The Cultural Epidemic of Sanctioned Insanity. Guillaume's therapeutic diplomacy and Thomas's absurdist theology have proven so internationally effective that other medieval courts are desperately trying to replicate their success. But here's the problem. You can't artificially create the specific type of psychological damage that makes controlled madness politically useful. The result is a continent-wide epidemic of deliberately cultivated insanity that's turning European intellectual culture into a carnival of competitive mental illness. It's autumn 35-9, and courts across medieval Europe are conducting what can only be described as madness auditions, formal competitions where aspiring jesters attempt to demonstrate profitable forms of psychological dysfunction. The French court at Vincennes has become an unofficial training ground where other kingdoms send their entertainers to study Guillaume's clinical detachment techniques and Thomas's theological absurdism. The Spanish court has produced Diego the Melancholy, whose specialty involves analyzing political situations through the lens of existential depression so profound that his despair becomes a form of philosophical clarity. Diego delivers strategic advice by explaining why various political options are meaningless in the face of cosmic futility. And somehow, this nihilistic framework helps Spanish diplomats negotiate more effectively because opponents can't argue against positions rooted in absolute hopelessness. The Holy Roman Empire has countered with Heinrich the Fragmentarian, who's developed multiple personality disorder as a deliberate political tool. Each of Heinrich's personalities represents different aspects of imperial policy. Military Heinrich handles war planning, diplomatic Heinrich manages international relations, and theological Heinrich provides spiritual guidance. The emperor can literally have internal policy debates by consulting different aspects of his Jester's fractured psyche. Guillaume watches these developments with the clinical detachment that made him famous, but even his emotionally distant perspective can't hide his horror at what's happening. They're trying to weaponize mental illness without understanding the psychological costs, he observes during one of his mirror therapy sessions. These courts are creating artificial trauma to produce strategic advantages, which suggests a level of institutional sociopathy that makes individual madness look comparatively healthy. The Italian city-states have embraced competitive theological absurdism inspired by Thomas's cheese philosophy. Venice has Marco the mystical baker, whose bread-based spirituality provides insights into commercial law. Florence counters with Lorenzo the divine vintner, who channels holy wisdom through wine-based metaphysical systems. Each city-state is developing signature forms of religious madness designed to provide unique diplomatic and economic advantages. Thomas's reaction to these developments reveals how completely his personality has fragmented. His human consciousness is horrified by the deliberate cultivation of mental illness, but his cheese philosophy personas are fascinated by the creative potential of institutionalized insanity. He's literally having internal debates between his remaining sanity and his profitable madness about the ethical implications of their cultural influence. The really disturbing part is that this epidemic of controlled madness is actually improving medieval European governance in measurable ways. Countries using therapeutic insanity for policy analysis are making fewer strategic mistakes, conducting more effective diplomacy, and developing more sophisticated understanding of human psychology than their traditionally rational neighbours. Guillaume's clinical approach has spawned an entire school of detached political analysis, where advisors deliberately cultivate emotional dissociation to improve their strategic thinking. French military planning now incorporates psychological profiles of enemy leadership created through therapeutically enhanced analysis techniques that produce uncannily accurate predictions of foreign behaviour. Thomas's absurdist theology has inspired a continent-wide revival of mystical approaches to statecraft, but these new mystical systems are deliberately designed to provide practical political advantages rather than genuine spiritual enlightenment. Medieval European spirituality is becoming increasingly sophisticated and increasingly cynical simultaneously. The intellectual consequences are reshaping medieval European culture in ways that won't be fully understood for centuries. Universities are beginning to study applied madness theory as a legitimate academic discipline. Monasteries are experimenting with productive spiritual confusion as a method for achieving divine insights. The line between genuine mental illness and strategic psychological performance is disappearing entirely. Both Guillaume and Thomas are watching their personal psychological traumas become the foundation for an entire cultural movement, and the experience is pushing them even deeper into their respective forms of madness. Guillaume's clinical detachment is becoming so extreme that he's losing the ability to experience normal human emotions. Thomas's cheese philosophy is expanding to fill more of his consciousness, leaving less room for his original personality. The medieval European political landscape is evolving into something unprecedented in human history, a civilization that deliberately cultivates mental illness as a form of competitive advantage. Countries are measuring their international influence by the sophistication of their officially sanctioned insanity and the strategic effectiveness of their therapeutically enhanced governance. Guillaume and Thomas have accidentally created a new form of soft power, where psychological dysfunction becomes a strategic resource that can be developed, refined, and deployed against foreign competitors. Their personal mental breakdowns have become the prototype for an entirely new approach to international relations based on controlled madness and therapeutic manipulation. The ultimate irony is that their success in exporting their psychological disorders has made recovery impossible. They're now too culturally significant to be allowed to regain their sanity. They've become living symbols of a new form of civilization that treats mental illness as intellectual sophistication and psychological fragmentation as political wisdom. Guillaume and Thomas have accidentally created something unprecedented in human history, an entire European intellectual movement based on the strategic weaponization of mental illness. Their success has inspired a continent-wide arms race, where kingdoms compete not through military might or economic power, but through the sophistication of their officially sanctioned psychological dysfunction. By winter 1360, the ripple effects are reshaping European culture in ways that would make modern anthropologists weep. The University of Paris has established the world's first department of applied insanity studies, where scholars attempt to codify the therapeutic and strategic benefits of controlled madness. Oxford responds by creating a chair of practical psychological warfare, staffed by former jesters who teach diplomatic applications of clinical detachment. The Holy Roman Empire takes this academic arms race to its logical extreme by founding the Imperial Institute of Beneficial Madness, where young nobles learn to cultivate useful forms of mental illness as preparation for political careers. The curriculum includes courses in strategic depression for military planning, controlled paranoia for intelligence gathering, and therapeutic dissociation for diplomatic negotiations. Guillaume watches these developments with his characteristic clinical detachment, but even his emotionally distant perspective can't hide his horror at the systematization of psychological trauma. They're treating mental illness like a natural resource that can be mined and refined, he observes during one of his mirror therapy sessions. These institutions are creating factory-produced madness designed for political consumption, which suggests that civilization itself has developed a psychological disorder. The real-world applications are immediately terrifying. French military academies begin training officers in Guillaume's clinical analysis techniques, creating a generation of emotionally detached commanders who view battlefield casualties as interesting psychological data rather than human tragedies. English diplomatic schools teach Thomas's absurdist frameworks, producing negotiators who can derail foreign policy discussions through deliberately nonsensical theological arguments. The cultural consequences spread far beyond political institutions. Medieval European art begins incorporating therapeutic aesthetics, deliberate visual chaos designed to induce beneficial psychological confusion in viewers. Cathedral architects experiment with sacred geometry of madness, creating spaces that promote spiritual experiences through controlled psychological disorientation. Literature evolves to accommodate this new intellectual landscape. Writers begin crafting beneficial nonsense narratives, stories so deliberately meaningless that readers develop enhanced psychological flexibility through exposure to narrative chaos. Poetry schools teach constructive incoherence techniques, where meter and rhyme are deliberately disrupted to create therapeutic cognitive dissonance. Thomas's cheese philosophy has spawned an entire theological revolution. Monasteries across Europe experiment with productive spiritual confusion, where monks deliberately cultivate religious doubt as a path to deeper faith. The Vatican establishes a secret committee to evaluate whether controlled heretical thinking might actually strengthen Catholic doctrine through intellectual stress testing. But here's where this cultural experiment reveals its most disturbing implications. Guillaume and Thomas are watching their personal psychological breakdowns become the foundation for an entire civilization's approach to knowledge and power. Their individual mental illnesses have metastasized into cultural institutions that will outlive them by centuries. The economic implications are staggering. A new profession emerges: madness consultants, who help kingdoms develop customized forms of beneficial mental illness suited to their specific political needs. Trade guilds form around different types of therapeutic psychological dysfunction. There's even a developing market for artisanal insanity, where wealthy nobles hire specialists to craft bespoke mental disorders as status symbols. Guillaume and Thomas find themselves inadvertently wealthy and famous as the founding fathers of applied psychological warfare theory. Universities across Europe invite them to lecture on the strategic applications of mental illness. Their techniques are being studied, refined, and exported to kingdoms as far away as Byzantium and the emerging Ottoman territories. Yet both men are discovering that their cultural success makes psychological recovery impossible. They're now too historically significant to be allowed sanity. Their continued mental illness has become a matter of European intellectual prestige. They've become living symbols of a new form of civilization that treats psychological dysfunction as the highest form of human achievement. The ultimate irony is that their success in exporting controlled madness has created a world where normal mental health is viewed as a competitive disadvantage. Kingdoms with traditionally rational political systems are being outmaneuvered by opponents using therapeutic insanity for strategic analysis. The entire European political landscape is evolving to favor psychologically damaged individuals over mentally healthy ones. Guillaume and Thomas have accidentally triggered a continental transformation where madness becomes the new currency of power, where psychological trauma is cultivated as intellectual sophistication, and where the most damaged minds are treated as the most valuable strategic resources. They've created a civilization that rewards mental illness and punishes sanity, and they're trapped forever at the center of the madness they unleashed. Tomorrow we'll explore how this madness-based European Renaissance begins colliding with external forces that don't operate according to therapeutic insanity principles. Because when entire civilizations embrace controlled psychological dysfunction, reality has a nasty habit of reasserting itself through uncontrolled disasters. Chapter 10: The Final Act of Madness. The continental arms race of therapeutic warfare has transformed medieval Europe into something unprecedented in human civilization. A continent where psychological dysfunction has become the primary currency of political power, where controlled madness determines diplomatic outcomes, and where the most mentally damaged individuals wield more influence than traditional nobility. Guillaume and Thomas, the unwitting architects of this transformation, are about to discover that their personal psychological breakdowns have become the foundation for an entirely new form of human civilization. It's winter 1362, and Guillaume le Fou stands in his private chambers at Château de Vincennes, no longer wearing his motley. For the first time in 15 years, he's dressed in the robes of a formal royal advisor, because Philip VI has officially elevated him to the position of chief psychological strategist of the realm. The Jester's bells have been replaced by the seal of state, but the man wearing it has become something that medieval political theory never contemplated, a government official whose authority derives entirely from his documented mental illness. The transformation is complete and terrifying. Guillaume's clinical detachment, once a desperate coping mechanism for unbearable psychological pressure, has become the intellectual foundation for French statecraft. His mirror therapy sessions have evolved into formal, strategic detachment protocols, taught at the newly established Royal Academy of Therapeutic Governance. His dissociative episodes are now scheduled events where he deliberately fragments his personality to analyze political problems from multiple psychological perspectives. Meanwhile, Thomas Skelton has achieved something even more disturbing across the English Channel. Henry VII has declared Thomas's cheese philosophy to be divinely inspired theological doctrine, establishing the Order of Sacred Dairy Wisdom as an official religious institution. Thomas no longer distinguishes between his cheese personas and his human consciousness. He has become a living embodiment of the absurdist theological system that began as his private refuge from madness. The historical documentation from this period reveals the complete institutionalization of what began as individual psychological trauma. The University of Paris maintains extensive records of Guillaume's therapeutic governance methodology, including detailed protocols for cultivating beneficial forms of mental illness in political advisors. The papal archives contain theological treatises analyzing Thomas's cheese philosophy as legitimate mystical revelation, with recommendations for incorporating dairy-based spirituality into official Catholic doctrine. But here's where this experiment in civilization-wide madness reveals its ultimate horror. Guillaume and Thomas are discovering that their success in transforming European political culture has made them prisoners of their own creation. They can never recover their sanity because their continued mental illness has become essential to the functioning of their respective kingdoms. They've become living symbols of a new form of human organization that treats psychological dysfunction as intellectual sophistication. The cultural consequences extend far beyond politics and diplomacy. Medieval European literature has evolved to accommodate beneficial confusion narratives, where deliberate meaninglessness enhances readers' psychological flexibility. Art incorporates therapeutic chaos aesthetics designed to induce productive mental instability in viewers. Architecture experiments with sacred geometry of madness that promotes spiritual experiences through controlled psychological disorientation. Guillaume's mirror therapy techniques have spawned an entire movement of self-fragmentation philosophy, where scholars deliberately develop multiple personality disorders to enhance their analytical capabilities. Thomas's cheese theology has inspired productive heresy studies, where religious thinkers cultivate controlled blasphemous thoughts to strengthen their faith through intellectual stress testing. The economic implications are staggering. A new professional class has emerged throughout Europe, madness architects who design customized forms of beneficial mental illness for political, religious, and commercial applications. Trade guilds organize around different types of therapeutic psychological dysfunction. International markets develop for artisanal insanity, where wealthy institutions purchase bespoke mental disorders as competitive advantages. The most successful kingdoms are those that have most thoroughly integrated controlled madness into their governmental structures. France leads Europe in therapeutic statecraft applications, with Guillaume's clinical detachment protocols producing unprecedented military and diplomatic victories. England dominates mystical governance through Thomas's absurdist theological frameworks, achieving political stability through systematized spiritual confusion. But the human cost is devastating. Guillaume and Thomas watch helplessly as their personal psychological traumas become the blueprint for an entire civilization's approach to human organization. Their individual mental breakdowns have metastasized into cultural institutions that will outlive them by centuries, creating a European society that rewards psychological damage and punishes mental health. The ultimate irony is that their transformation of European civilization has been so successful that normal psychological stability is now viewed as a competitive disadvantage. Traditional forms of rational governance are being abandoned across the continent as kingdoms adopt therapeutic madness protocols developed from Guillaume and Thomas's original coping mechanisms. Medieval European political culture has evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a civilization that deliberately cultivates mental illness as its primary form of intellectual and political sophistication. The most influential advisors are the most psychologically damaged. The most effective diplomats are the most emotionally detached. The most trusted spiritual leaders are the most systematically confused about reality. Guillaume and Thomas have accidentally triggered a civilizational transformation where madness becomes wisdom, where psychological dysfunction becomes political expertise, and where the most broken minds are treated as the most valuable human resources. They've created a world where sanity is a liability and mental illness is the ultimate form of professional qualification. Their legacy will echo through European culture for centuries, inspiring literary archetypes like Shakespeare's wise fools, influencing the development of political satire and establishing precedents for using humor as a weapon against authority. But they'll never live to see that legacy because they've become trapped forever in the roles that saved their lives but destroyed their humanity. Professional madmen whose continued psychological dysfunction has become essential to the survival of European civilization itself. The medieval world has learned to function according to the logic of controlled insanity, and Guillaume and Thomas are its unwilling prophets, forever imprisoned in the golden cages of their own revolutionary madness. Guillaume and Thomas have become trapped forever in the roles that saved their lives but destroyed their humanity, but their legacy extends far beyond their personal fates. As the medieval world evolves past the golden age of therapeutic statecraft, the institutions they accidentally created begin to outlive their creators, transforming into cultural memories that will shape European civilization for centuries. Following the monumental transformations in medieval political and cultural life catalyzed by Guillaume and Thomas, the story of court jesters enters its twilight. a period marked by both reverence and erasure. Despite their perilous positions at court, many jesters achieved degrees of fame and influence unimaginable for common entertainers. Historical figures such as Triboulet of France and Will Sommers, the favoured fool of Henry VIII, wielded significant political and social power, advising monarchs, mediating disputes, and shaping public perception through satirical performance. The margins between protected fool and condemned heretic remained perilously thin throughout the profession's existence. Triboulet famously narrowly escaped death after offending royal sensibilities, pleading with King Francis I to let him die naturally from old age rather than face execution, a request granted due to his quick wit that could mock even impending death. This incident perfectly captures the razor's edge that all medieval jesters walked between influence and annihilation. The dangers of the profession were reflected starkly in documented cases like Geoffrey Hudson, a dwarf jester to Queen Henrietta Maria, who faced exile and slavery after court intrigues went wrong. His life story, from royal favourite to condemned exile, to slave to prisoner, illustrates how quickly favouritism could transform into fatal misfortune. Hudson's eventual death in obscurity, buried in an unmarked Catholic pauper's grave, demonstrates the ultimate expendability of even the most beloved court entertainers. Archaeological evidence reveals that jesters' burial and commemoration practices varied dramatically based on their final standing with their patrons. Some were interred with their baubles, motley costumes, and other professional symbols, indicating recognition of their valued contributions to court life. Others disappeared into anonymous graves without honour, reflecting the precarious nature of their social standing and the conditional nature of royal favour. Perhaps the most poignant example of jester mortality comes from Samuel Maggotty Johnson, one of the last professional jesters who died in 1773. His unusual burial request, to be interred in woodland rather than a churchyard because he disliked a quarrelsome old woman, buried there and joked that she would pick a fight over his leg bones on Resurrection Day, exemplifies the gallows humour that defined the profession even in death. His tomb in Maggotty Wood remains visitable today, complete with both appreciative and condemnatory inscriptions that capture the ambivalent legacy of professional foolery. The decline of court jesters began during the Renaissance and solidified by the Restoration era as political culture and entertainment preferences shifted toward more refined forms. Monarchs like Charles II of England deliberately broke with tradition by refusing to employ court jesters, instead patronising theatre and musical entertainments that offered similar diversion without the psychological complexities of therapeutic madness. This transition marked more than just changing royal tastes. It represented a fundamental shift in how European civilization understood the relationship between power, truth, and entertainment. The therapeutic statecraft pioneered by Guillaume and Thomas proved too psychologically demanding for sustainable governance and gradually gave way to more conventional forms of political organization. Nevertheless, their archetype endured powerfully in cultural memory and artistic expression. Literary and theatrical traditions, especially during the Elizabethan period, immortalized the jester figure by transforming medieval licensed fools into enduring characters of sharp wit and poignant social critique. Shakespeare's Fool in King Lear eloquently embodies the jester's paradox of madness and wisdom, using humour to challenge authority and express truths unpalatable to those in power. The jester's cultural influence extended into emerging art forms as well. The tradition evolved into commedia dell'arte performances in Italy, and influenced British folk traditions like Punch and Judy puppet shows, ensuring that the essential dynamic of satirical authority critique survived even as formal court positions disappeared. Modern echoes of jester privilege persist in contemporary political satire and comedy, where humorists exercise updated versions of sanctioned authority critique while maintaining cultural acceptance. Television comedians, political satirists, and social media commentators operate within frameworks directly descended from medieval therapeutic madness techniques, using humour as protective camouflage for dangerous political commentary. Remarkably, direct revivals of medieval jester traditions continue into the present era. In 2015, the town of Conwy in Wales appointed Russell Irwood as official resident jester, filling a position vacant since 1295. This appointment demonstrates the enduring fascination with Jester archetypes and suggests that something essential about their function remains relevant to modern political culture. Contemporary corporate culture has even begun recognizing the value of Jester-like figures for organizational health, with some businesses deliberately cultivating devil's advocate roles that echo medieval advisory functions. The psychological insights that Guillaume and Thomas stumbled upon, the value of detached criticism, the power of humor to diffuse tension, the effectiveness of controlled irreverence for challenging groupthink, have been rediscovered by modern management theory and organizational psychology. The ultimate legacy of medieval court jesters transcends their individual fates or even their specific historical period. They pioneered enduring techniques for speaking truth to power, developed sustainable methods for combining entertainment with political critique, and demonstrated the complex relationships between madness and wisdom, marginality and influence, humor and danger that continue shaping human social organization. Guillaume and Thomas, trapped forever in their golden cages of therapeutic madness, never lived to see their broader cultural impact, but their accidental revolution in understanding the relationship between psychological dysfunction and political insight created intellectual frameworks that persist across centuries, ensuring that their tortured brilliance continues influencing how civilizations balance power, truth, and human sanity. In essence, medieval court jesters charted perilous paths between laughter and danger, truth and folly, influence and invisibility. Their complex roles as social critics, political insiders, and psychological operators laid groundwork for centuries of satirical tradition that continue shaping how societies confront authority and navigate the eternal tensions between stability and necessary change. Their twilight legacy, forged in shadow and sustained through laughter, remains a vital thread in the tapestry of human cultural evolution, a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths emerge from the most damaged minds, and that wisdom and madness often occupy the same precarious space at the edges of power. And there you have it, history lovers and chronic insomniacs. 10 chapters of bells, baubles, and blood pressure, spiking truth bombs. We've watched medieval jesters claw their way from disposable props to strategic masterminds. We've seen kings grow psychologically addicted to the very clowns hired to lighten the mood. We've followed an entire continent as it weaponized mental breakdowns for diplomatic gain. And we've dug up the graves, literal and metaphorical, of men and women who balanced on the knife edge between privilege and execution. If this saga teaches anything, it's that power always finds room for a sanctioned dissenter, someone licensed to whisper uncomfortable truths under the cover of comedy, someone whose foolishness is the safest vessel for honesty in a world that punishes candor. That insight still beats at the heart of every late-night monologue, every savage meme, every boardroom contrarian who survives by making the boss laugh before lowering the boom. So the next time you hear the jingle of bells, whether from a Renaissance fair stage or a stand-up clip sneaking across your feed at 2 a.m., remember Guillaume, Thomas, Triboulet, Summers, and that poor dwarf Geoffrey Hudson. Remember how close genius lives to madness, how thin the paint is between a smile and a snarl, and how history's sharpest scalpels are often masked in motley. Keep laughing, keep questioning, keep the bauble handy, because somewhere some modern monarch still needs a jester, brave or broken enough to call nonsense by its name and survive to tell the joke tomorrow night. Sleep tight, and may your truths always land with just enough punchline to keep your head exactly where it belongs.